Sexual energy is not merely a biological urge, it is one of the most potent forms of life force that a human can generate. When this energy is not dissipated through constant gratification, it begins to accumulate and intensify within the individual. Rather than remaining stagnant or becoming repressed, this energy seeks expression in other areas: intellectual thought, artistic creation, physical vitality, and focused ambition. Throughout history, mystics, warriors, philosophers, and inventors have practiced forms of sexual restraint, not out of shame or denial, but because they recognized that this energy, when preserved, sharpens the mind and intensifies the will. It is the raw, untamed current that fuels vision and perseverance. Modern psychology might call it libido, but its effects go far beyond sexuality. It is the fire behind innovation, the clarity behind a breakthrough, and the charge behind relentless determination. When one refrains from excessive indulgence, the body starts to rechannel this stored vitality. The eyes grow more focused, the voice gains resonance, the posture aligns. The mental fog begins to clear. This redirected energy refines itself into creativity, presence, magnetism, and stamina. The mind is no longer hijacked by compulsive desires. The attention, once fragmented, now becomes a laser pointed at meaningful goals, deep thinking, and self-mastery. Sexual abstinence, when undertaken consciously, becomes more than a physical practice. It becomes a psychological crucible. By resisting the habitual urge to discharge sexual energy through instant gratification, an individual is forced to confront what lies beneath the surface of that urge. Desires that were once appeased automatically must now be faced, examined, and understood. This confrontation awakens the deeper layers of the psyche and initiates the process of integration, of becoming whole. Much of human behavior is driven by unconscious motivations. The sexual instinct, being one of the most powerful, often dominates silently. In a state of indulgence, it operates in the shadows, subtly directing thoughts, behaviors, and choices without resistance or reflection. However, when abstinence is practiced, this unconscious content rises into awareness. Fantasies, memories, projections, insecurities, all that had been hidden beneath the gratification begin to emerge. This emergence is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be. The friction created by restraining powerful impulses reveals the inner fragmentation within the self, the war between desire and discipline, the tension between instinct and intention. But it is precisely this friction that generates growth. The psyche, like a mineral under pressure, begins to crystallize into something more refined. Parts of the self that were once rejected or repressed, shame, guilt, longing, aggression, must now be acknowledged. These aspects are not enemies to be destroyed, but energies to be understood and harmonized. Sexual abstinence acts as a mirror, exposing the illusions we carry about love, lust, power, and identity. Without the buffer of pleasure, we see more clearly the attachments we form to others. How often we mistake validation for intimacy or possession for connection. We begin to observe the emotional patterns and relational wounds that feed our sexual appetites. Often, we discover that what we crave physically is a substitute for something we lack internally: affirmation, comfort, escape, meaning. In this way, abstinence reveals not only the surface-level behaviors, but also the deep psychological needs that fuel them. As these revelations unfold, something remarkable begins to happen. The conscious self grows stronger. The individual begins to observe their thoughts and impulses with detachment rather than being controlled by them. This ability to witness oneself objectively is the foundation of integration. The fragmented parts of the psyche, impulses, fears, fantasies, are no longer split off or denied. They are invited into consciousness, named, and given meaning. Abstinence also brings about the collapse of persona, the mask one wears to navigate the world, often crafted to attract or seduce others. In the absence of sexual pursuit, this mask begins to dissolve, revealing the authentic self beneath it. The individual is left face to face with who they are when no one is watching, when no one is being impressed, and when desire is not being performed. This confrontation is sacred. It is here that one begins to form a relationship with their true identity, not the socially constructed image, but the integrated self, whole and rooted. The practice of abstinence, therefore, becomes a journey into the underworld of the self. It requires courage, patience, and self-inquiry. It demands that one feel what they would normally flee from. But this descent is necessary for genuine transformation. In resisting the impulse to project desire outwardly, the energy turns inward, illuminating the shadow, those disowned parts of the personality that contain both darkness and untapped strength. As one brings light to these inner regions, there is a gradual reorganization of the psyche. Soji. Destructive tendencies can be transmuted into insight. Raw emotions can be tempered into wisdom. Inner conflict gives way to coherence. The individual begins to act not out of compulsion, but from clarity. Sexual abstinence is a voluntary withdrawal from one of the most instinctual human drives. To resist such a powerful biological impulse is not an act of repression, but of conscious control. It is a deliberate decision to place long-term growth above short-term gratification. In doing so, the individual engages the core faculties of willpower and discipline, qualities that, once cultivated, extend far beyond the realm of sexuality and begin to shape the very structure of one's life. At its essence, willpower is the ability to hold a chosen direction despite internal resistance and external temptation. It is the psychological muscle that allows a person to say a no to something that feels good in the moment, in favor of something that carries deeper meaning. Practicing abstinence trains this muscle repeatedly. Each time one refrains from giving in to sexual desire, especially when it's easily accessible or habitual, there is an internal strengthening that occurs. It's the strengthening of the observer, the part of consciousness that can witness desire without being enslaved by it. This self-overcoming develops discipline, which is the consistent application of willpower over time. Unlike motivation, which fluctuates, discipline is reliable. It is built on routine, structure, and integrity. When a person begins to abstain not out of fear or shame, but out of alignment with a higher goal, they begin to value consistency over craving. They are no longer ruled by the rhythm of impulses. They become the rhythm. Discipline, especially in matters of sexuality, reclaims autonomy. In a culture saturated with hypersexualized messaging and instant digital gratification, most people unknowingly hand over their agency. Their moods, choices, relationships, and even self-worth become entangled with how often they pursue or receive sexual validation. Abstinence breaks this cycle. It strips away the dependencies and reveals whether one truly governs their own life. It shows whether the individual is a sovereign being or simply reacting to urges like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. Through sustained abstinence, attention that was once scattered begins to converge. The ability to focus deepens. With fewer dopamine spikes from indulgence, the brain recalibrates and previously difficult tasks become more manageable. Work becomes more purposeful, goals become more vivid. The self, once divided between desire and action, becomes united in forward motion. In this unity, the individual begins to experience an inner peace born from integrity. What they say, think, and do begins to align. But the training of willpower through abstinence doesn't only serve personal ambition, it also reshapes emotional life. The person becomes more resilient in the face of discomfort, less reactive to frustration or rejection. This stoic strength does not imply coldness, but clarity. One becomes less susceptible to being manipulated or distracted. This creates space for deeper relationships, once not built on neediness or compulsion, but on mutual respect and presence. The ability to delay gratification also allows for more conscious choices in partners, clearer boundaries, and a higher standard for intimacy. The will, once passive and dormant, becomes active and directive. It moves from being a whisper beneath layers of impulse to becoming the driving force of one's character. This fortified will translates into every domain of life, whether it's fitness, career, study, or artistic pursuit. It empowers the individual to persevere when progress is slow, to choose discomfort when ease is tempting, and to act with purpose when others drift with the current. The disciplined person, forged through abstinence, doesn't seek comfort above all else. They seek clarity, strength, and self-ownership. Their actions are no longer dictated by craving, but by conviction. The body, mind, and spirit come into alignment not through force, but through sustained choice. This inner cohesion becomes the foundation for mastery, not mastery over others, but mastery over the self, which is the rarest and most essential form of power. Sexual abstinence doesn't just affect the physical body, it reconfigures the internal lens through which reality is experienced. When the noise of constant craving is reduced, the mind begins to quiet, and in that stillness, perception sharpens. What once went unnoticed in the rush of stimulation becomes clear and vivid. The subtleties of human behavior, the energy in a room, the meaning behind a word or a glance, all become more detectable. Abstinence refines the senses by removing the fog created by overstimulation, allowing a person to see with greater depth and listen with more sensitivity. A large portion of perception is not sensory but psychological. It is shaped by inner states, desire, fear, anxiety, expectation. Sexual desire, when constantly active, colors perception in a very particular way. It distorts clarity by projecting fantasy onto people and situations. The mind begins to see not what is, but what it wants to see. This kind of perception is filtered through craving. It is selective, idealizing, and often self-serving. It reduces others to symbols of gratification rather than allowing them to be seen as complex, autonomous beings. By stepping away from indulgence, that filter begins to dissolve. Interactions become less transactional and more truthful. You begin to observe others without the unconscious question, "What can I get from them?" No. Instead, there is space for understanding who they are, how they think, and what energy they carry. Body language, tone of voice, subtle shifts in emotional resonance, all these become accessible to a mind no longer clouded by lust. This leads to an increase in emotional intelligence, empathy, and discernment. In addition to perception, intuition begins to flourish. Intuition is not just a mystical feeling, it is the synthesis of vast unconscious data that the rational mind cannot process all at once. However, when the nervous system is overstimulated by compulsive habits, especially those involving dopamine, such as sexual release, intuition gets drowned out. The inner voice becomes a whisper lost beneath the constant noise of desire. Abstinence, by lowering the baseline of stimulation, creates space for that whisper to be heard again. This heightened intuition manifests in several ways. Decisions are made with greater confidence, not because they are calculated logically, but because they feel aligned at a deeper level. One begins to sense when a situation is right, or when a person is genuine, even if there is no immediate evidence. There is a visceral knowing that emerges, rooted in stillness and self-connection. The more abstinence is practiced, the more these intuitive signals strengthen, because the individual is no longer dissociated from their own inner compass. Moreover, the internal gaze turns sharper. Without the compulsion to seek validation or pleasure externally, the person begins to look inward with more honesty. Patterns of behavior, old wounds, unconscious fears, they begin to rise into awareness, and with this awareness comes the ability to respond rather than react. One no longer moves through life as a bundle of conditioned responses, but as a conscious participant. This inner clarity affects the outer world. Life becomes less chaotic because perception is no longer distorted by internal chaos. Abstinence also enhances creative perception. The same energy that fuels sexuality is the root of imagination, inspiration, and insight. When it is not spent, it accumulates and begins to rise, often expressing itself through dreams, visualizations, and spontaneous ideas. The individual may notice an increased sensitivity to symbolism, pattern recognition, and abstract thinking. The mind becomes more spacious, more open to paradox and complexity. Ideas once inaccessible now float to the surface naturally. This doesn't result in detachment from reality, but a deeper connection to it. One sees more because they are less distracted. They feel more because their nervous system is no longer numbed. They hear more because the inner noise has quieted. Perception, once dulled by overstimulation, becomes luminous. Intuition, once drowned by craving, becomes the guiding thread through uncertainty. Sexual abstinence, when undertaken not as suppression but as conscious choice, often becomes the gateway to a deeper spiritual transformation. What initially begins as a physical discipline gradually unfolds into an awakening of awareness that transcends the body. The sexual energy that is withheld does not disappear. It intensifies, condenses, and begins to rise within the individual. It becomes a fuel not only for productivity and clarity, but for inner evolution. This process, often referred to as transmutation or inner alchemy, is the art of refining base instincts into higher states of being. At the root of sexual desire is the longing to merge, to dissolve boundaries, to experience something beyond the self. On a physical level, this takes the form of union with another, but abstinence forces that longing inward. inward. It redirects the quest for union away from external fulfillment and toward the source of consciousness itself. The energy that was once poured into physical union now flows toward spiritual union, toward wholeness, toward the realization of the deeper self that exists beneath identity, thought, and form. This inner redirection awakens dormant aspects of the psyche. The individual begins to feel a pressure building within, not just a pressure of desire, but a pressure of potential. This is the crucible of alchemy, the stage where fire meets matter, where desire meets discipline, where instinct meets awareness. In this tension, something new is born. The old identity built on craving, validation, and impulsive satisfaction begins to dissolve. In its place emerges a self that is forged not from habit, but from presence. Spiritual traditions across time have recognized the role of sexual energy in the journey toward awakening. Whether described as Kundalini in yogic systems, Kai in Taoist alchemy, or simply life force in mystical teachings, this energy is never denied but transformed. This masculine energy creates structure and focus, allowing a person to stand firm in their values and direction without being swayed by passing urges or the need for external validation. On the other hand, abstinence also reveals the nature of the inner feminine. Without the constant dance of attraction, one begins to notice the subtle qualities of emotion, intuition, and sensitivity that have often been ignored or overused. The feminine within, when healed and reintegrated, becomes a source of creativity, empathy, and authentic magnetism. It is not passive but deeply alive, moving with the rhythms of life without being consumed by them. Through abstinence, this feminine essence becomes clearer, more conscious, and more respected. The mastery of this polarity begins when these two energies are no longer in conflict, but in cooperation. The masculine provides the vessel, the feminine fills it with life. The masculine decides the direction, the feminine informs it with meaning. The masculine commits, the feminine receives and transforms. In sexual abstinence, these principles are not played out in the act itself, but internalized, cultivated, and expressed through presence, speech, behavior, and intention. The more one understands and balances these forces within, the more harmonious and magnetic their relationships become. This internal mastery naturally affects external dynamics. In romantic relationships, true polarity is rekindled. When a person is no longer needy for sexual interaction, they become more grounded in their essence. The masculine becomes more attractive not because it chases, but because it radiates stability and depth. The feminine becomes more attractive not because it seduces, but because it expresses authentic feeling and intuitive wisdom. Attraction, then, is no longer based on superficial signals but on energetic integrity, on the coherence between inner truth and outer expression. Abstinence also cultivates respect for the self, for the body, and for others. Without the haze of craving or conquest, people are seen more clearly. The tendency to reduce others to objects of desire begins to fade, replaced by a deeper appreciation for who they are as whole beings. This clarity transforms relationships from transactional to transformational. Connection becomes rooted in resonance, not strategy or seduction. Boundaries become easier to hold, standards naturally rise, and the individual no longer compromises their values for fleeting satisfaction. Within this container of restraint, power consolidates. Masculine energy is no longer diluted through constant release. It becomes a reservoir of strength, calm, and purpose. Feminine energy is no longer scattered through seeking attention. It becomes focused, radiant, and wise. This is not about becoming more masculine or more feminine, but about embodying the core of each principle in a purified form. When aligned, these energies serve not only personal evolution, but collective harmony. They inform how one leads, loves, speaks, and creates. They ground the individual in a reality where power is not taken, but cultivated through conscious embodiment of one's true, energetic nature.